Well, if government forces successfully encircle Aleppo city, it would take away one of the opposition's most valuable bargaining chips in future negotiations. Government forces and their allies began their Aleppo campaign late last year. Now, according to the Institute for the Study of War, this is the territory that the government held in September. The ISW says that by December, the government conducted operations in the southern, eastern and northern countryside of Aleppo city to draw opposition forces out of urban terrain. This is how it looks now. The areas we've circled indicate the likely targets of future government offensives. Let's talk more about this, and joining us live is Rami KHOURI. He's a senior fellow at the Issam Fares Institute at the American University in Beirut. First of all, Rami, let's talk about who in the opposition, the Syrian forces, are actually fighting in Aleppo.
Well, you've got a range of different groups. I mean, there's hundreds of smaller groups, but there's a few big ones. Jabhat al-Nusra is there, Ahrar al-Sham is there, some of the Free Syrian Army groups are there, and a lot of smaller ones. And they keep shifting relationships. They create coalitions. They form bigger groups now and then. There are probably 30,000, 40,000 forces with the rebel groups fighting, and they, of course, will now adjust to the situation. Some of them will leave, others will hold their ground and fight to the death. We don't know what will happen, but the biggest problem for the rebels is that if they are encircled, they will probably be subjected to a siege, as the Syrian government has done in many other places around the country, to force the rebels to give up or create a ceasefire and leave, simply because they're starved into submission.
It's not looking good for the opposition, is it? It's being significantly weakened, especially in this battle. What does that mean for these talks that are due to restart on the 25th of February between the two sides?
Well, you really have to answer that question by looking at the 3 or 4 concentric circles of events that are happening. You have the talks in Geneva, which are suspended, which never really got going, but there is a serious attempt to try to get a negotiating process to create a ceasefire and then maybe lead to a transition. The chances of that happening are virtually zero, but people are seriously still trying to do it. At the same time, you have events on the ground with the different rebel groups, I mentioned many of them, and the Syrian government, and the Syrian government supported by Russia, Hezbollah, and Iran, and some other militias that come in to help from Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. And then you have the third level, which is the proxy battle between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the region. And the Saudis and the Emiratis have been talking about sending some special forces on the ground to help fight against the Syrian government and the Russians backing them. So you've got these 3 or 4 different dynamics happening at the same time. The real story in northern Syria, I believe, is that there could be a significant shift in the balance of power on the ground, with the Russian, Syrian, Hezbollah, and Iranian group dominating that region and dealing yet another blow to the Saudis in yet another proxy battle, which they will have lost in the region. And then you get possible Saudi troops coming in and facing Russian troops, with NATO member Turkey possibly getting involved for its issue with the Kurds as well. And then there's ISIS, which nobody's talking about. The ISIL or ISIS, they control the territory to the east of Aleppo, and nobody knows, will they come and help some of their fellow Islamist militants like Jabhat al-Nusra? They're not on very good speaking terms, but if one of them faces an existential threat, will the other come and help them? We don't know this. The Russians are not attacking very many ISIL positions right now. They're mostly attacking the forces that are threatening Assad. So you've got these 4 different dimensions of this conflict: battlefield, negotiations, proxy war in the region, and Russian involvement. And all of these are moving at the same time. So it's an incredibly complex situation, but it is definitely changing. This is a historic turning point, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if Aleppo does fall to Assad, will we then see the arrival of all these, or a further arrival of all these outside actors, or do you think they might move in before Aleppo falls?
Which outside actors you're talking about?
Talking more about the Saudis getting involved, possibly the
anti-Assad forces
Turks.
or the pro-Assad forces? We don't know. They have floated this idea. They're going to be discussing it. The Saudis and the American foreign ministers met yesterday in Washington. There's meetings in Europe this week, NATO meetings in Munich and other places. So there's an incredible amount of discussion taking place about this. And if any Saudi or Emirati forces go, they're going to be very small numbers probably, and it's more a symbolic gesture than anything else. But if it does happen and you end up with a more robust military aid program coming to help the rebels fighting against the Assad government, you might then get other Arabs or even other people from places like Pakistan, maybe, we don't know, and possibly more American involvement. And then you get the prospect of a Russian-NATO confrontation on the ground, militarily and on the air, in northern Syria. Everybody would want to try to avoid that. In fact, the Saudis are talking now with the Russians and the Turks behind the scenes, trying to designate areas where, you know, the Saudis can work here, the Turks can work here, the Russians can bomb there, so they don't end up fighting each other or sparking an inadvertent Russia-NATO military battle. It's just an incredible situation. But this is the consequence of 60, 70 years of bad governance in the region, Soviet-American proxy wars, supporting dictators, corruption, disparities, poverty, brutality by regimes mostly in the region. And this is the consequence. So I'm not surprised this is happening. It's a terrible tragedy. And you have flows now in the tens and 20s of thousands every day. 30,000 we heard have left Aleppo. There's fears that up to 200,000 could go north to Turkey or southwest to Idlib. And some people have been talking about maybe 1 million new displaced people or refugees within Syria. So the scale of the human suffering is unprecedented. We've never seen this before in the Middle East any time in recent history. To go back to find something like this, you have to probably go back to the biblical accounts thousands of years ago. So this is really a terrible, terrible moment for Syria above all. But really the Syrian problem is a more intense example of similar stresses, dysfunctions, human suffering, and oppressive governments with external intervention that are happening all over the region, in Libya, in Yemen, in Palestine, in Somalia, in Iraq, Lebanon years ago. It's still a regional problem that keeps popping up in terrible situations, and Syria is the most violent, the most terrible, the most inhumane situation right now, but it is just the tip of the iceberg of bad governance, corruption, mismanagement, and mass human suffering all over or in many parts of the Arab world. And sending more troops from Arab countries like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or others is going to make it worse. It's not going to make it better.
Okay, Rami KHOURI, always great to speak to you. Thanks very much for joining us there.